This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. This is my Father's world. We sing these two hymns with seemingly contradicting meanings sometimes. While the songs themselves don't contradict, the ideas held by Christians often do. Is this world our home, or are we just a passing through and the things that happen here don't matter? That brings us to the topic of today's episode, pietism. Pietism began in the 17th century as a Lutheran movement, and it was a reaction to the scholasticism that was going on within Lutheranism. There were so many debates about the scholastic matters of theology that the founders of pietism realized we're getting away from the individual relationship with God. That thrust, with a good heart behind it, began to emphasize the individual walk with God, your prayer time, your holiness, your personal life. And yet, as it went on, it became too much of a pendulum swing the other direction, taking God out of the things that govern all of life and relegating him only to your individual religious spiritual life, locking God inside our hearts and inside the church building. But we can't live that way as Christians. Christ is Lord over every inch of creation. Christ is Lord over all of life. And so as we turn our attention to pietism this week, we begin to examine this question of what does it look like for our Christianity to touch on every aspect of our lives and of our culture? Welcome to Who Let the Dogma Out, where Christ has dominion over all of life. I'm one of your hosts, Jack Wilkie, joined as always by Jacob Rutledge and Daniel Mayfield. Man, getting through that was a little hard. I think we're all a little tired, a little undercaffeinated here, but we're going to get going on this one.
I'm ready to go, man.
Yeah,
well, Jacob, the youth minister is. What do you got? A Mountain Dew over there and a large pizza?
Hey, don't be blasting Mountain Dew now. I will drink a good Mountain Dew too.
Jacob's going to have to carry us through this one, man, because I don't, like I said, I couldn't get through that. My stuttering, and Daniel, you're tired. So,
well, why do we not have the siesta built into our day?
Yeah,
that's one part of South American culture that's wonderful.
Hey, speak for yourself, man. I'll go in the library and take a nap when I need to.
Well, look, I'm not saying that I don't take a siesta. I'm just saying it's not built into the day properly.
I'll tell the secretary, hey, I gotta go to look at a book in the library real quick.
Yeah.
You know?
I need to go say some prayers.
Yeah. Hopefully this episode doesn't serve as a siesta, but I think we've got a pretty interesting topic here for the listeners. In fact, every podcast, their listeners have a name. So our listeners, I'm calling you guys the Dogmatics now. So thank you to the Dogmatics for tuning in. For those left results, we've got reviews. We've got some good reviews coming in. So thank you to those Dogmatics. But let's get into this topic of pietism. There's a few things we're going to talk about: the pietists, the Anabaptists, radical two kingdom theology, but essentially this idea that our Christianity kind of sticks with us, that we don't have influence over the world, that culture is not of interest to Christ or to the church. And so there's a lot of directions we can go with this. We've got an outline we want to work through, but pietism, again, started off in the right place. You need to have that individual relationship with Christ. Sure. It needs to not just be the head, but the heart as well. But I think where they stopped is we have that phrase, the head, the heart, and the hand, right? Of it's your knowledge, your affection, but also your actions. And if it doesn't ever make it to the hand, you've got a limited faith as well.
Well, how many theologies are merely reactive? And it seems to me that that's just how we do it. There's a wrong on the right, so we swing to the far left. And I remember reading Francis Schaeffer a number of years ago, and he said that orthodoxy always leads to dead orthodoxy, which is when the orthodox no longer has a heart behind it. It's just the externals, it's just the outer sacrifice, it's just the sacraments or whatever. And then dead orthodoxy always leads to heterodoxy. So there's a different orthodoxy. And that's exactly it. And that's what happened here with these Lutherans who were, within the Reformation, coming out of the Reformation, were arguing over every little every doctrinal distinction, even the ones that we would say would be secondary matters. And they just said, look, something's wrong here. We need to focus a little bit more on the heart of the matter and our personal devotion. And there needs to be some kind of relationship between the brothers. And so you're right. It started out good. Pietism really was about calling back all of those things Jesus said about the heart. I mean, isn't that what Jesus addressed with the Pharisees? You know, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters, namely justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You know, you're a whitewashed tomb, but you're full of dead men's bones. And so they're saying a lot of those kinds of things, and it was meant well and it started well. But when your focus is only on what's happening in the heart, something's wrong when, like you said, it never reaches out to the hands.
Isn't it nice that we don't have that in the Church of Christ? The people who nitpick the minutia versus the people that overreact to that. Right. We don't have that at all, do we?
I don't know if we were going to go there. But I do think that we have seen that within the Churches of Christ, where there was a period of divisiveness, of kind of this hyper focus on minor things, or not even necessarily the issue of debating them or discussing them, but drawing lines of fellowship. And what came out of that, I think, is now you do see, I think, a movement within the church and saying, hey, we need to realize that there are some other things that matter as well. Our relationship with the Lord, our relationship with each other. And so there's a downplaying at times on doctrine. I think there's some, so as we mentioned, I think there's a good emphasis that was much needed when it came to the church about, we really need to focus on who we are as a people and our relationship to God. And we also need to make sure that we're focusing on the issues that really matter, and not getting caught up in some of the details of some of these things. Although we would argue that, we wouldn't want to minimize the importance of doctrine or minimalize doctrine. We'll have a whole other episode on that, so I don't want to get into that. But I wanted to say, I think it's important real quickly to define what we mean by pietism or what we mean by piety. Because when we're critiquing pietism, we're not critiquing piety. Piety is the opposite of pietism, right? So within piety, you have the idea of a God-fearing individual. So it's the word within Scripture that is often used as godliness. And it speaks of someone who's a God-fearing person who lives in allegiance and devotion to God. And that type of life, when you say someone's a God-fearing person, they're a pious person. Implied within that is that it impacts every facet of their life, right? I mean, Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, while bodily training is of some value, godliness or piety is of value in every way, as, now notice this, it holds promise for the present life and for the life to come. So notice godliness and God-fearingness and a pious life impacts how we live now greatly, but also impacts the life to come. Mm-hmm. Whereas pietism is mainly focused on kind of your personal relationship with Christ, what you do kind of personally between you and him, what you do in worship, and maybe the relationships that you have within the church itself. But when it comes to impacting other areas of your life, doctrine, or not, well, even it leads to a de-emphasis in doctrine, in my opinion. But politics, economics, social matters, when it comes to that, well, no, that stuff doesn't really matter, because that's not focused on horizontally with me and God. It doesn't really impact my ability to spread the gospel or to talk to people about the gospel. So, that really shouldn't matter. Whereas we would say, I think, that if you are a God-fearing person, you're truly devoted to God, that is going to impact all of who you are. It's going to have benefits for the present life and the life to come. Would you guys say that's a good assessment of that?
For sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. And, just to kind of dovetail that with an application from a movie that I saw, I don't know if it came out in 2016 or 2017, but there was a movie called Silence, and it was about a couple of Portuguese missionaries.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see it?
Yes.
That went over to Japan during the 17th century.
Yes. Powerful movie.
Yeah, it was. And they did a lot of good. And the church was under heavy persecution. And this one missionary, both of them, I believe, ended up apostatizing. They ended up denouncing their faith. And really, there was this one scene where the missionary Rodriguez was watching some villagers that were Christians being persecuted. They were hung upside down, and they like made little slits in their forehead so that they would bleed and hang upside down. It was just awful. And they said, we will not stop torturing these people until you denounce your faith. Well, he wrestled with this, ultimately denounced his faith, and lived the rest of his life with regular denouncing of his faith. But at the end of his life, when he died, his wife put a little cross amulet in his hand, and it was indicating that he really was a Christian the whole time. And the whole point of the movie was, look, Christianity, the true place of the Christianity is in the heart. You can denounce Christ publicly. You can live completely, never saying a word about it. But if he's in your heart, then I think that's pietism.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, what's interesting about that too.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying what's interesting about that film too, just a quick side note, is that throughout the film, there's this individual who's like this, I don't know if you remember the disciple who ends up being the traitor. You know, he's always like very weak. He makes these claims and then he ends up backing out on it. And I think at one point, maybe he betrays some of them or something like that and reveals where they are. And this whole time, but in the end, remember, he's the one that actually ends up openly professing his faith and dying for it.
Yeah.
Right. Isn't that how it goes? So you have the weak traitor, you know, who struggled the whole film, who you're like, this guy is just, you know, and then he ends up actually dying. And so to me, the end of the film ends up like, he's kind of viewed as almost the one, you know, who was commendable. But I think there's multiple messages there. Cause I think you're right. I think that's exactly what the film is trying to portray. And I think that's the kind of Christianity that most Christians would prefer and most Christians believe in.
Well, I was going to say, how many churchgoers have my personal relationship with Jesus? I mean, that term dominates the evangelicalism in America, personal relationship with Jesus. Now, doesn't mean that you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, but it's not just you and him. It's not just in your heart. It plays out. And if Satan can't keep you from being a Christian, his next goal is to keep you from doing anything with it, from going outward with it, right? It's going to stick to you. And so that's this pietism we're talking about, is me and God. I have my Bible and prayer time and all that, but I'm not going to force my morals on anybody else. I'm not going to, tell anybody else. I'm not going to stand for anything. All of these things we're talking about, I'm just going to keep it to me.
I heard one guy say, Satan's goal, and I think really, and this was not the original intention of pietism. And those that do kind of adhere to this pietistic framework, I don't even think they mean this. I don't think they've really thought through it. There have probably been points in my walk where I was a little bit more along these lines. But the goal of it is to keep the Christianity internal to where it would never move beyond your person. And I heard somebody say, look, Satan doesn't care if Christ lives in your heart. He just doesn't want him living out in the world. He doesn't want him changing the way people think. He doesn't want him changing institutions. If Christ just lives in your heart and that's it, and he never moves beyond it, that's no threat to the enemy. And it also says something of, does he really live in your heart if he doesn't move you?
Can I ask a question about going back to something Jack was saying a minute ago? I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on this because I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this episode. This idea of the language of relationship. Now, I know that's become a very common way of describing our connection with God and being back into reconciled to God in relationship with him. Right. But what's interesting to me is that is not the word that's used in the New Testament to talk about our reconciliation to God. The word is fellowship. And I find it interesting that even the newer translations still are not translating that word as relationship. So I wonder, is there a component of the word relationship that implies something that maybe isn't as effective as the word fellowship? And the reason I say that is because generally speaking, and I'm just thinking out loud here, because I have had occasionally some pushback and I've always fought against that. No, it is a relational thing. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, to me, fellowship, if you look at that word fellowship within the Greek, the koinonia, the joining hands, you're joining hands. It's a harmony, and you're joining hands for a purpose and a cause, right? There's It's a covenant. It's covenant language.
There's a like-mindedness. You're building together. You're moving in the same direction. And if you think
Which
about
relationship doesn't necessarily imply all of that, to me at least.
I would add to that where relationship does come in is Christ and the church, right? It's not an individual thing. It's all of us. And so that's the fellowship he has with his own. And we're part of that fellowship, part of the church, but that also makes him the head.
right.
That's one of the things that's so key is this relationship is him as the head, us as part of something bigger than ourselves. That's where the relationship is. And it's not this personal, me and God, I come to God my own way thing. It's that's not allowed. That's not part of the terminology of the New Testament. I think that's a good point.
And I guess I even wonder, like, what is like, because relationship, and I don't have any issue. I'm sure I'll continue to use that word, but there's also some maybe tones that come with using that word that might not necessarily be true about our connection with Christ.
It does have a semantical shift over time. Think about the way that any relationship in today's society has been dumbed down.
That's what I'm saying.
And has been stripped of its substance. The marital relationship, how much does even what we would say is the closest kind of relationship that there can be, a husband and wife. And that relationship is essentially a contract that you can get in and out of as you want. And people would say that relationship is just built on how you feel about one another. And I do think that that's a lot of what the pietism of today is. It's my relationship. Well, I feel keen toward Jesus, and therefore I know that I'm good with him, even though I don't love his people, and even though I don't follow his commands, and even though I'm literally doing nothing for the kingdom. But because I feel this certain way, so I
wonder about that relational, the emotional aspect, because I was thinking about this as well. Like we've talked about this, how the church struggles to appeal to men at times. And I wonder if some of that has to do with like some men, if all of what they know about the faith is it's spoken in terms of being in relationship with Christ.
Right.
That might bring hyper emotionalism into their minds, whereas fellowship is more of a covenant duty bound language, which I tend to think of that in terms of piety and godliness. And I loved what Eric Kahn had to say in his podcast about that, where he had a quick phrase where he said something along the lines of, duty is freedom from your feelings. And I think that, man, that is,
wow.
I'm just speaking from personal experience here, because I told you guys beforehand, I kind of came out of some of that pietism, still, in some ways coming out of it. But I think that, he just hit the nail on the head, because I think he comes from a similar background in that episode, because he talks about how when pietism is your focus, when the only way by which you gauge your relationship with God is how you are feeling personally inside, and how you're feeling about God, you are constantly navel gazing, right? You're constantly he called rummaging around in your own heart. Yeah. And it can be absolute agony. Yes, you can have moments where you feel like, on these emotional highs, or these or maybe not even, you mean relational highs, but like there's also some really deep lows.
You're going to be right. That's exactly right. You're going to be chasing, if that is the measure of my walk with the Lord and my sanctification is how I'm feeling in any given moment, then my faith is going to be all over the place. One day I'm going to feel secure in my salvation. The next day I'm not going to feel secure in my salvation, because how often do you wake up with, what we'd call a case of the Mondays, even as ministers, even as preachers, where you just don't feel quite right. And maybe you don't feel that close to the Lord at that moment. Well, we need to have freedom from our own emotions. That's what duty really is. Chasing that emotionalism has led to, it really did lead to the charismatic movement, where you had to have some kind of physical showing outwardly of what he's doing inside of you. It'd be by way of tongue speaking or whatever. But
one of my critiques of, I think we all read John Piper, is, and I've had this conversation with other people who read him, is his Christian hedonism thing of enjoying God and, really desiring God and all those things. And there's an important point there. But one of the things you find yourself doing is, am I enjoying God enough? When I go to worship, did I really enjoy that? Did I really enjoy being in God's presence? And is my daily walk, is it really, and it's like, stop thinking about yourself. And I think that's one of the things we're getting at with pietism is there's no outward expression. Like the outward expression is, this is my walk with God. And so I want to talk about another ism that's kind of a cousin to the pietism and maybe a broader scale, is the Anabaptism thing of kind of the approach to the world and culture of Christianity, and this idea that the church is not really to engage with the world, very much removed from the world. The world does their thing, we do our thing. You know, you guys, Jacob, you mentioned pietism was something you were kind of, you know, bought into for a while. I think I did too. But this Anabaptist thing, I really, really bought into, of like, the church isn't supposed to confront the culture. The church is, let's just work on ourselves and evangelism and an internal community and fellowship and good things, but that there's no external, there's no changing the culture, there's no shaping the world, there's no any of those things. It's just constantly us and internalized. And so it's like pietism on a church scale, I guess is a way to put it. What's been your guys' experience with this, and how do you see this really playing out right now?
P. Andrew Sandlin was commenting on this in another podcast, and he mentioned that it really comes down to your theology of what God is doing in the world. Is God, like we sang in, or like we sing in these songs, this world is not my home. And I think a lot of us carry with it the idea that, look, what happens here doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to get to the other side. But it begs the question, why did God make the world? And what is God's intention, and what is God's purpose for mankind within the world? And again, this goes back to Genesis. What did God say? Well, let's make man in our image. And by carrying that image, God said, I want you to fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over it, conquer the world in a godly way that is in tune with my laws, my character, my person. And I think that so many today don't really believe that God is concerned with what's happening on the world, on the broader scale of the world. And I was actually, while I was driving over here today, before the podcast, I was thinking about this. If you back out from the Bible and you just look at the whole story from the beginning to the end, if you're completely honest with the text, I don't think you'd get the idea that the only concern God has is with who happens to be his covenant people at that time. God is always concerned with nations. He's raising nations. He's bringing nations down. He's orchestrating even natural disasters. He's sending prophets over to pagan societies, calling for them to repent and turn to the living and true God. And it seems to me that God's concerned with everyone and everything. And it just, a theology that stops at the four walls of the church, it's not going to protect the church from anything that's going on beyond it.
Yeah, and I think that part of that, man, there's a whole lot that goes into this. I mean, this is something that's been deeply embedded within Christianity. I mean, even before the Anabaptist movement. I mean, Tertullian was a big proponent of complete lack of engagement with culture, with any type. I mean, any engagement with culture, really, not just politically. And so there has been a strain of that thought really from, in some ways, the beginning of the church. And to an extent, some of it is true in the sense of, you know, being separate from the culture and not being influenced by the demonic powers that influence. We know, you know, be in the world, but not of the world, you know, not falling in love with the world and its institutions, and, you know, 1 John 2 and verse 15. But the issue is, and this is what we were talking a little bit beforehand, is that, I mean, to me, it's almost a moot point. It's almost like a moot discussion, because it's literally impossible to not engage with culture. I mean, even say that a group of Christians is like, we're just going to, you know, be Christians in our own little community and, you know, preserve our ideals and way of life. And we know that there's been groups that have done that. There's other voices right now that are pushing that with the Benedict option. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with that and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But okay, so say you do that. Number one, everyone that's going to be in that community is still bringing culture with them, because they are bringing whatever they were previously a part of. How they think about things, how they speak, what they value is all influenced, and they're all bringing that to that community. But not only that, once they get there and they decide that they're going to create their own community, how's that community going to be governed?
Right.
What rules are going to govern it? You have to create a new culture. And you have to create a new system by which things are authoritatively ruled. So unless you're just going to say, okay, we're a church and then we only live our own lives. Well, even that in and of itself is a system of government.
Right.
And so that I was talking a little bit about Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, before that. And I wanted to read this quote from here because I thought this was good, critiquing this idea. He says, "It is so with all the members of what he calls the radical Christian group." And he doesn't mean that in a derogatory way. But when they meet Christ, they do so as heirs of a culture which they cannot reject because it is part of them. They can withdraw from its more obvious institutions and expressions, but for the most part, they can only select and modify under Christ's authority something that they have received through the mediation of society. So his point is like you can only withdraw from society to a certain extent. It's literally impossible to do that. So the question isn't, whether we can or cannot engage or disengage from culture, is how much we are going to do so, what's going to be the ruling principle as we engage with it, and who's going to receive the most amount of influence.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to, let's present their argument, I guess, as they would, and go at it from that. They bring up verses like John 18:36. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." So he's not interested in political power, is what they would say that means. Ephesians 6:12. Our war isn't against flesh and blood. It's against the demonic, against the authorities, the spiritual forces. Hebrews 11:13 through 16, where in the middle of that chapter of the great people of faith, that they were looking for a home that's not of this world. Again, they're thinking bigger. And so this Anabaptist theology that, again, kind of is hand in hand with the pietist thing, is the song, "This world is not our home. We should not try to affect it. We're just trying to get through it and focus on the spiritual, focused on heaven, focus on evangelism." But again, you run into those questions or those issues Jacob just introduced, and a couple more, like if you're really successful evangelistically and you convert 80% of a culture,
what's going to happen then?
Yeah, then, oh no, oops, we influence culture. Oh no, everyone doesn't open their businesses on Sunday anymore. Oh no, this is awful.
Right.
Where does that end? But so with that being their argument, there are verses that talk about not of this world, of looking to the next world and things like that. And so how would you guys respond to that?
Well, just because it's not of this world, it doesn't mean it's not in this world. I think that we've misunderstood what Jesus meant when he said the kingdom's not of this world. He just means the kingdom isn't a creation of this world. It is a divine kingdom, and it is based on godly principles. It's not based on what Paul would call the present God of this world, Satan himself. If you're exactly, when you think about, if you had 80% of the culture was Christians, and God would expect that those Christians, wherever they go to work, would act like Christians, then hopefully in acting like Christians, they're going to be making Christian policies. Hopefully their business deals are going to be in ethic that accords with Jesus Christ. Hopefully their medical procedures are going to be in accordance with Christ. And if you had a whole hospital that was made up of Christians, well, they better be acting like Christ. So it ultimately falls flat. It's a failure to allow what we are internally to expand outwardly. And Jesus, who said, my kingdom's not of this world, he also said, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. If the salt has lost its tastiness, it's good for nothing but to be trampled. Nobody takes a light in a house and puts it under a basket. It should be emanating. It should be pervading. It should be opening eyes. That's and then to the idea of our war not being against flesh and blood, it isn't. It's against demonic powers. But the reality is, demonic powers, Paul has this all through his writing. Demonic powers do their main work through ideas and philosophies, which is why he says in Jesus Christ, we bring down every stronghold and we destroy any argument or lofty opinion that's raised against the knowledge of God. Don't be taken captive by philosophies. You think about it in the world that we're living in right now. You either have the option, if you're to say, look, Christians shouldn't change the culture, then what that means is you need to completely withdraw and go form one of those societies, like a Mennonite society or the Amish, because if you don't change the culture around you, the culture is going to change you. Right?
Yeah, but then even as one of those, as Jacob said, you're touched by the culture around you. You're governed by the government around you. You have all of, like, they have to comply with certain things, and they're like, they get a little more consideration than the rest of us because the way they've separated. But they still are forced into things they might not want to do, and so
It's because they make such good furniture. I mean, really,
and the cheese, yeah,
good bread,
Yeah.
really
yeah,
good
bread.
I'm
But
all
their
for that
their
culture.
rifles up in, I'm from Minnesota, so we had a lot of Amish up there. My goodness, they may be riding a horse and buggy, but their rifles were like the top notch.
So
We're like
that level of
Amish, we have like
technology
Amish
is okay.
snipers.
Amish.
Yes, they're using the best because there's no electricity.
But okay, use the Amish. There's and there's a lot of Anabaptists, like in the Mennonites, is one of the strongholds of some of those ideologies. But I've known Christians in the churches of Christ who don't pay attention to the news at all and don't think we should. And I'm not a nightly news watcher. I think that's not great. But on a macro scale, like I was talking to somebody and brought up, hey, that's great about the Supreme Court thing back when Roe versus Wade was struck down, and they didn't know what I was talking about. And I kind of got a little bit of a lecture, like Christians shouldn't care about that stuff. That's just not our interest. Right. And that's one of the manifestations of this is like, that doesn't matter to us. It's just our job to save souls.
Well, and I mentioned that in my sermon on Sunday that here at Dripping was about like, I found it funny that those individuals who were like completely against political engagement from Christians also recognized they were happy to see that Roe was overturned, but they were like caught in an enigma because they also don't believe Christians should be politically engaged. So it's like, it was like a catch-22. They didn't know what to do, Yeah.
We want the pagans to enforce our stuff, but goodness, we shouldn't do it.
And I want to go back to the John 18:36, because if you just read back a little bit earlier in John 17, Jesus said of his own disciples, they are not of this world, in John 17 around verse 16. So he said of themselves, they are not of this world. But in that same chapter, he says, I pray that you not take them out of the world, but that you keep them in the world. Okay, so they're still in the world, even though they're not of the world, meaning that they don't operate the world the way the world does. Their priorities, their authority in life are completely heaven-centered. Mm-hmm. And even the idea of Hebrews chapter 11, of seeking a heavenly country, you guys are probably familiar with Augustine's city of God. Augustine had this concept of the city of God and the city of man kind of working interchangeably, and that throughout time, God is trying to manifest the city of God within the nations of men. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's progressively coming to be through the ebb and flow of history. Mm-hmm. And you see that, by the way, even within the Abrahamic covenant, right? Because that's really who he's looking back to, is Abraham and the people of faith, how they were expecting a city that was built by God. Now, I think the heavenly Jerusalem and the new city is ultimately found within the new world and with the new heavens and the new earth. But when he's talking about that in Hebrews 11, I think really what he's saying is it wasn't that Abraham wasn't looking for an actual city. He was looking for an actual city. But what was his city built upon? What was his heritage going to be built upon? It wasn't going to be built by his own efforts, by his own cleverness, by his own power. It was going to be built upon the promises of God giving him the land and establishing his lineage through his miraculous power.
Right.
I don't even see a lack of materiality in Hebrews chapter 11.
Right.
I think it's talking about the source of where we find our authority, where we find our values. We are dwelling in, even Ephesians, when he says how we've been lifted up to the heavenly places.
Right.
He doesn't mean that we're like literally in heaven right now. He's saying that our center of being, everything that we're about, we're already exalted with Christ in the heavenly places. That reign is ultimately going to be realized within the resurrection, but we're even reigning now. And and I think that is what some people miss when it comes to that.
Well, that's so you bring up Abraham. I mean, the promises to him are directly, you read chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel and what they're trying to do, and the promises to Abraham. We're going to make a name for ourselves. I'm going to make a great nation of you. We're going to have this land for ourselves, this city unto ourselves. I'm going to give you a land. They were trying to build themselves up to be, ruling over the world. And there was, no, you don't get to do that. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to confuse your language. And then God picks Abraham and says, all of that stuff they wanted, I'm going to do it for you if you act on faith. Yes. And so again, that whole it's not of this world. That's not you can't read Genesis 11 and 12 and not see those are the two different ways to go about this, and one will fail and one will work, and you expect it to work. And then again, this idea that like, if it works, oops, we screwed up. Like, now hold on.
Right. Do you think that that there has been somewhat of an intentional semantical shift concerning the word politics, to where anything that's categorized under politics, the modern Christian is going to say, or many Christians are going to say, that has no place. Don't bring that into the pulpit. Recently I was preaching on abortion, and I wasn't even mentioning the word politic. I was just talking about abortion and how God hates murder and how God values life and is the creator of life. And somebody after the fact said that they shut down immediately because I was talking about politics. This is what do you think? Do you think that this is one of the problem areas, one of those, as Paul would call it, a stronghold, where we get this idea that no, that has to do with public policy. But when you actually stop and you think about it, does the creator of heaven and earth care when there is a group of men, whatever you call them, who are making laws that protect your choice to destroy life, and that are making places where life can be destroyed? The one who makes people in his image, does God care about that? Or is God saying, look, that's outside the four walls of the church. I don't care about that, and that shouldn't be your place.
Well, I'll give you this example. This morning, I had a discussion with somebody from the Anabaptist point of view, the David Lipscombite point of view. This is not for Christians to get involved in this stuff at all. And, that Christian political power, it's tempting to civic political power, but it's not for Christians. Jesus doesn't want us to do it that way. So I brought up here in Nashville, just, down the road from me, the Vanderbilt thing, where they were doing the trans surgeries, and it was a cash cow for them. And they were trying to like push kids into this awful stuff. I mean, like ruining their lives. And it was Matt Walsh and some people online got a hold of this, blasted them, got it out there to Congress people and to people in authority. And those laws changed within a week or two, where they were banned from doing that.
Right.
And it's like, well, number one, from the Anabaptist point of view, you have to say that's a bad thing. They shouldn't have done that. Right. Number two, and I put this to the guy, and he said, that's not the right way to go about it. Is what we should do is we should evangelize and bring about change that way. How many kids' lives would be destroyed if we waited until all the doctors converted to stop doing that? That's just not how it works. But we don't want to get our hands dirty. Politics is not as clean as evangelism, for sure. And you might have to team up with some people that you don't agree with on things. Yeah, but politics isn't evangelism, and that's okay.
Right. And the very one, I think Jacob mentioned this before, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is that the very ones that are against any kind of civic engagement wouldn't say the same thing at all when you go back to the Civil War in the United States and the abolition of slavery, right? When you think about
civic, they're going to be consistent. I mean,
but they're inconsistent. In so many personal conversations, they're totally inconsistent with
Take
this.
Lipscomb himself. Lipscomb was very anti-war, very anti-involvement, anti-government, everything else, but he was an abolitionist. Like, well, why are you advocating a law in a certain direction?
Right.
Man?
That's not the church.
Lawlessness.
Right. Yeah. That's a cotton farmer down that's a cotton farmer. That's not the church. And that's why I think what we see is this breaks down very quickly. As you said earlier, Jacob, it can't be played out in reality. I heard somebody say, if you make it your rule to say, look, we're not going to address anything of politics, he said, you cannot protect the church from politics by refusing to protect politics. And if you look over the past few years and the kinds of social changes that have happened with just with COVID and the different kinds of lockdowns and the way that people reacted, why is it that so many churches were so quick to give in to these ideas that are clearly against the Bible? Well, it's because we've relegated every subject, besides a few, besides the very few of what you do for 2 hours on a Sunday morning, we've relegated those to social issues, civic issues, politics, and we've refused to address them. But by refusing to address them, look, our members are going to the workplace. They're going to public school institutions. They're listening to public news outlets, and their minds are being shaped by ideas and ideologies that do not come from God. And then guess what? they come into the church. And so the church becomes political in a very non-Christian way.
The other thing is, if the police came out tomorrow and said, we're never going to give another speeding ticket to any car that's painted red, you know what we would all do? We'd all go start buying red cars or painting our cars red. So when the church says, we're not going to talk about politics, you know what the world does? Okay, your little boy going to the bathroom, that's political.
That's politics.
We'll just make everything politics. And now all you guys can do, and we're back to pietism, all you can do is have Jesus in your heart. You can do that.
Right.
We're going to shove you into that tiny corner, and that's all you
exactly
got.
That's exactly it. That's what I was trying to put my finger on earlier was, what have we done with the word politics to make it to where it's kind of this catch-all phrase that keeps the church from addressing the issues that are the biggest and that are really affecting us. When you get into a conversation with somebody on the sidelines, these are the issues they're wondering about, and they're hungry for it. Where are they going to turn for answers if not the church?
Which, by the way, is so different from the faith of Israel, right? The faith of Israel in God was an all-encompassing, here we go, guys, I'm going to use it, full-orbed
there it was.
Faith.
There it was.
It was a full-orbed faith. You go through the law, and it impacts areas of economics, how they love their neighbor. Okay, so we say, okay, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what in the world does that mean? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Well, Leviticus 19 talks about that, and speaking frankly with your neighbor, having open and honest conversations instead of, fostering bitterness in your heart. Well, what about what happens if, their dog gets out and attacks my child, or their ox gets out and gores my dog? What happens then? How do I deal with that then as a Christian, or at that point as an Israelite? All of those things are impacted by their covenant with God. Every area of life. And you see that, by the way, represented within the way that the Israelite camp was built. The tabernacle was at the center of all of the tribes, and they centered it like the hub of a wheel, right? So God was literally at the center of their life, and spiritually at the center of their life. And so what you have happening now is that you have Christians who they're so focused on their 10-minute devotional time in the morning, and what they post on social media. That's the locus of what their spiritual life is, right? And things like that, and maybe what they do in church on Sunday, but they have no concept of how faith impacts other areas of their life, how it impacts the things that they're involved in, how much time they relegate to certain functions, where they give their money, how much money they give to things. And it's like, all of a sudden, those things that Scripture is meant to talk about and does talk about, it's like we have no concept of how to see life through the lens of that which is sacred.
Well, it goes back to I think one of our very first episodes where we're talking about why we need to be dogmatic. And, if who let the dogma out where doctrine has dominion over all of life, it goes back to the Scripture where he says, look, the Scriptures are able to give us everything pertaining to life and godliness. And the problem is, and this is really the reason for this show, is we do not have a robust Christian worldview. It goes to what Francis Schaeffer was saying about Christians thinking in pieces and not in wholes. We have little bits and snatches that we understand about. We should sing in this way, and we should baptize in this way, and we shouldn't say curse words, and we know that, but we've failed to see the big picture, what God is doing in the world, and His concern with everyone. If you're talking about Israel and His concern for Israel, and sort of what the hub of that was. But remember, what did God tell Israel as they were getting ready to make that covenant with Him? He said, if you do this, you will be a kingdom of priests. They were to be a priest, essentially a nation that was a priest to all of the nations.
Yes. Which you see in Jonah, by the way, right? You see Jonah as a priest calling a pagan nation to repentance.
Right. And Nahum going to, didn't Nahum also go to Nineveh and Obadiah? Yeah. And these guys, it's all through the Old Testament where God's concerned. But the thing that's interesting to me is you get into Romans 13, and Paul talks about, first of all, who established government. And if we want to say the government, God doesn't care about politics. Well, who established the the civic government? God did.
Where does their legitimacy come from?
It comes from God. And what does God expect of them? That they would punish wrongdoers and praise good doers. And therefore we can deduce, I think very confidently, that if they punish doers of good and reward doers of evil, then they will be judged by God for those policies and those laws.
Oh,
so
certainly.
if Jesus is reigning right now and he cares about those things, doesn't it follow that the Christians should be engaged in it to a degree?
Or shouldn't we at least
the Lipscomb-ite
desire
thing,
that?
though, is kind of like he kind of looks at Romans 13 and goes, well, nuh-uh. That's almost his argument of, governments are in opposition to God and all that. But, I want to point out, you guys used a lot of Old Testament there, and that's the Old Testament.
Right.
That's why we did last week's episode before this. That's why we outlined it this way, to do that in this, because so much of the pietistic stuff is essentially pretending the Old Testament doesn't exist. And so we're talking a lot about political engagement, but Jacob, you brought up your economics and the way you approach that. Another one is self-defense and things like that. And so John Piper, bring him up again. He's very much a pietistic view of the world kind of guy. Had that article that he got a lot of controversy with a few years ago, where that question, the classic question, somebody breaks in, they're going to beat up your family, kill your wife, rape your wife, whatever it is. Would you stop them? Well, he went to, I don't have a gun, and I don't know what I would do, because I need to be governed by my love for that person and show him the love of Christ.
What about the love for your wife?
Your love for your wife, your love for your kids. It's not loving to that person to let them get away with that sin. There's so many considerations, but it's the over-spiritualized, overthinking. Everything has to fit back into preaching the gospel kind of thing, where some things aren't preaching the gospel. Some things are just living according to God's principles, and defending your wife from attack is a good thing to do.
Right.
And if you read the Old Testament, that's blatantly obvious. But if you try and divorce your faith from the Old Testament, and this isn't us being theocrats and saying, take the Levitical law and make everyone in America follow it. But the principles are there. Yeah, we'd be worse off, right?
Yeah,
I'd give up shrimp to give up Drag Queen Story Hour if we can, I'll make that trade. But,
which law would we rather have?
Right.
And
but,
you mentioned,
when you divorce yourself from everything that happened before Matthew chapter 1 and just pretend that these things matter, it's all gospel, all evangelism, it's a train wreck.
None of that. But here's my thing, though. None of that a lot of times people want to go to Matthew chapter 5 through 7. None of that makes sense without the context of the Old Testament. You cannot understand, for example, what Jesus means by being meek without understanding what the Old Testament talks about meekness. David was considered meek. Moses was considered meek. And these were men with immense power, right? You can't understand any of that, even when it comes to resisting an enemy and what he means by that, in slapping someone on the cheek and turning to them the other. You can't even know what that means. And I think that is the problem when it comes to that issue of self-defense. I preached on this a year or so ago and did a couple sermons on it, because to me, it is, again, another doctrine that has to be rejected out of hand, because it cannot be lived out practically. And I've asked guys who are radical pacifists, or at least claim to be. I don't actually believe there is such thing as a true pacifist, because I think at the end of the day, if someone is going to attack you or your family, you're going to automatically defend them. If not, you're a coward. If you don't defend, I will say it on the podcast here lovingly, but if you do not defend your wife and your children, you are a coward and you're worse than an infidel.
As I said, we did a think deeper on self-defense. I said, from that point of view, the cops that stood outside that elementary school and watched the kids get shot up did the right thing.
Yep. Right.
That's horrific. You cannot embrace that. But this is pietism.
But that's the thing.
The results.
It goes against even natural revelation, because any time that I've spoken with somebody that carries that pacifist idea, most often they'll say Christians shouldn't do this. Now, if I were ever in a situation, I know that I would do it. Well, if you're already making concessions prior to the hour of it happening, you ought to sit down and think about that a little bit more.
What they say to me is, well, that's a hypothetical. That's a hypothetical. I'm like, no, it's not.
It's not hypothetical. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues that I want to bring up, or one of the areas I think that is problematic, this may be a point of contention here, is the way that we've defined the kingdom of Jesus. Now, we've got written here in the outline where Jesus in Matthew 13 said that the kingdom is like leaven that is going to pervade. It's going to go through the entire loaf, or the kingdom is like a mustard seed. It's going to start out very small, but it's going to grow to be the biggest feature in the entire garden. Now, historically, what we've limited the kingdom to what institution?
The church.
The church. And I have no problem, and I agree that the eternal state of the kingdom is going to involve the people that were in submission to Jesus Christ and were actually covered by his blood. Those people are in the kingdom. But you get indications in the parables of Jesus that the kingdom is a little more expansive than that. For one, Jesus said that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are reclining at the table in the kingdom. Well, they weren't a part of the church. They existed prior to its institution. And you also have Jesus saying that at the end of the age, he's going to come and separate all of the evil out of his kingdom. And so you've got, even within the kingdom, people that are not going to be in the kingdom in its eternal state. My belief is that a better a definition of the kingdom is that it is the reign and rule of Jesus Christ, which is going to fundamentally and primarily be in the hearts of men, but it's also going to affect things. It's going to be concerned with laws that would protect babies. It's going to be concerned with ethics on a public level. It's going to be concerned with abolishing slavery. It's going to be concerned with bringing his reign into everything. Otherwise, what does it mean when he said, all authority on the earth is mine?
Your kingdom come.
Go baptize the nations.
Yeah. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Right.
And I think in different cultures, different periods of time, different periods of history, the church's opportunities to influence those things are going to look different, right? So in the early centuries of the church, they did not have political sway or political influence. So what did they do? Well, they adopted they adopted the babies that were being thrown outside the city walls and raised them as Christians.
Right.
They spoke truth to political power whenever they were given the opportunity. Whenever Paul was brought before the governors within the book of Acts, what's he telling them? He's telling them, there's a new king in town and you better govern well because you're going to be held accountable for it.
Right.
Hoping that those kings would repent.
What authority did John the Baptist have going to Herod and saying, hey,
right,
it is unlawful for you to be married to that woman?
Or telling the soldiers how they should conduct themselves. So notice that he's telling people. So here's the question. What does it look like? What would it look like if a king repented? What would it look like if President Biden repented and changed? Now, my point being is that repentance, I don't even know if repentance in that situation would even necessarily mean, okay, he has come, fully around to everything that is right doctrinally, as much as it is repenting when it comes to his actions and like his policies
like a
that he is
Nebuchadnezzar.
Enforcing. Yeah, like a Nebuchadnezzar or
King
like
Nineveh.
the king of Assyria.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what it looks like when a king repents. And it's a church's responsibility to, if anything, even if you decide not to go and vote, but if anything, to be the moral conscience of the nation. Now, I believe, and I push Christians to vote, and I encourage them to vote, because I think that that's a way that the church can be a moral conscience to the present society. But again, when you even talk about voting, well, that has nothing to do with my faith, right? That has nothing to do with what it means to be a Christian. All that goes back to that pietism, right? The idea of none of this really matters other than what I do in my private home, what I do personally within the church building.
Yeah.
And the reality is that is just not, in my opinion, what we see within Scripture.
Well,
and
I've mentioned this a couple times in the past. It was a few episodes ago, but I always go back to this. And honestly, I don't know how to read this text any other way. But this is 1 Timothy 2, when Paul says, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions, and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. What's the implication? What kinds of prayers are being said on behalf of those kings and those people that are in decision-making positions of authority? What's the indication when the end result is that the Christian gets to lead a tranquil and a quiet life as a result of it? Doesn't that mean the policies changed?
The policies changed, but you continue reading. He talks about evangelism. He wants all men to come to repentance. Right. And so we say evangelize, evangelize, evangelize. That's how we change culture's evangelism. And our evangelism is directly connected to what the government does here. He's saying pray that they would give us a climate for good evangelism. Now we keep doing it either way, but like you can't, because that's what's presented as. I brought up that conversation I was having earlier, and that was the thing. No, we don't do political power. We do evangelism. We don't, we're not involved in politics. We're involved in evangelism. Well, why not? This is a false dichotomy. Why do we have to choose? The other thing, there's a proverb in Proverbs 3, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in the power of your hand to do so. We talk about that charitably a lot, and that's an important thing. If you can help somebody do it, if I can do something that helps those kids stop getting funneled into this trans slaughterhouse that leads them to suicide and I mean, literally, scarred for life kind of stuff, awful stuff, ruin their lives at 13 years old. And we have the power to do something about that. And we say, no, I'm not supposed to be political. If we have the power to stop abortion and to save these mothers from their regret that they're going to have, so many of them have. We could have done it, but no, I kept my principles intact. And boy, look at me, God, I didn't get my hands dirty. I mean, come on. But then Jacob made a great point I want to get to as well before we get to kind of some closing thoughts. A lot, not everybody, it's not a one-for-one, it's not a perfect circle Venn diagram, but a lot of the people who would take issue with what we've said here about engagement, about the world, about all that stuff, and pietism, and they're very pietistic people, but one thing they will say is we need to take care of the poor. We need to stand up for the oppressed. We need to get involved in racial stuff, social justice warriors, Black Lives Matter, all of this stuff. A lot of times, those are the people that are on this side. And so it's like, why is that okay, but this isn't? Why is your engagement pietistic? Why is your engagement spiritual, but saying, you know what, there should be laws preventing these kids from getting these surgeries? I'm making an idol out of politics. I'm getting my hands dirty and engaging with the world and all that stuff. I mean, it doesn't really add up.
It's more about appeasing the secular powers and what they're saying at the moment than it is actually holding to some fundamental problem that they have with addressing the culture. That really exposes it.
Ironically, it's a misunderstanding of the gospel itself in some ways, or misunderstanding of who Christ is. Because you feel totally fine emphasizing certain aspects of what they probably view are values and priorities of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about this with the interaction that, Jack, you had with that other individual. We were talking about that. And a lot of times this is informed by the theology of the cross. And obviously, like one of the central tenets of Christianity is like, we suffer for the sake of men, right? Because of our love for our fellow man, just as Christ did, we suffer for the sake, but it's not suffering just for the sake of suffering. It's suffering for the cause of truth and justice. It's suffering for the cause of victory. And you now that we're on this side of the cross, you can't view the cross without the resurrection and ascension, meaning that the cross was the pathway to true and lasting victory, and that Christ is no longer only the suffering servant. He's also the reigning king. So we have a different perspective on the cross than prior to the cross. The cross is placed within the context of the reigning king. The crown of thorns is turned into the crown of glory. And so all of that has to be taken within context, is that, yes, we are called to suffer as Christians for the sake of our fellow man. But sometimes that suffering means taking the authority and opportunities of influence that God has given us to speak and to enforce the truth where we possibly can, to stand up out of love for our fellow man who are being victimized and who are being harmed by destructive and bestial ideologies, and suffering for them because of that.
And Jesus stood up to the people of power in his day and time. He loved them. He cared about them, but he wasn't backing down from them. And that is eventually what led him to being crucified.
Right. Paul, I mean, think about Paul going into Athens. Who did he meet with? Who did he meet with up on Mars Hill at the Areopagus? He's meeting with the people that were making the decisions for that whole place. And he's saying, look, y'all are a religious people, but all these gods that you're worshiping are not real. You need to turn and serve and repent and serve the living and true God. So,
well, and the funny thing, one of their favorite verses of this ideology is Proverbs 31:8, opening your mouth for the mute and the oppressed and speaking up and standing up for them. It's a great Bible verse. It is a Bible verse. It's talking to a king. It's saying, hey, as king, do this. Mm-hmm. And so, that's one of those. And then they say, well, we all need to do that. Well, we do. But this comes from the top down. This comes from influence. And it's really funny. Like you and I say, hey, abortion should be outlawed. And that's Christian nationalism. Hey, we should stand up for the oppressed or whatever. This Bible verse needs to be applied by the government. That's not Christian. It's so ridiculous. But the pietism, it's just full of contradictions, and we could go on them probably all afternoon. So we'll wrap right there. We're gonna get to Gnosticism next week, and so we're gonna call it.
Up. I'll drink 2 bangs for that one.
Two bangs for Gnosticism.
Because in Gnosticism, the body doesn't mind. The body doesn't matter. So go ahead.
All right. So we're going to wrap right there. Again, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you guys next week.